On the morning of June 19, 1976, a southwest wind came across Holt County, Nebraska at 32 miles an hour, with gusts to 44, and it carried with it the topsoil of every unprotected dryland field in its path. This was not a storm. There was no thunder, no lightning, no dramatic event to mark the beginning or the end. It was simply wind, the specific, persistent southwest wind that the Great Plains had been producing for as long as there was a Great Plains. And it did what wind does to cultivated dryland soil that has no barrier between it and the open horizon. It picked up the finest particles first, the silt and clay that give topsoil its water-holding capacity and its fertility. And it moved them east and northeast as a low brown haze that local farmers had been watching all their lives and called dirt moving, and which the Soil Conservation Service called wind erosion, and which was, by any name, the farm's future leaving the field. Carl Dostal's west field lost approximately 3/4 of an inch of topsoil that day. It was the third wind event in 4 weeks. The total topsoil loss across June 1976 in the Dostal West field was approximately 4 inches. Len Koenig's west field, 120 acres immediately east of the Koenig farm's 6-row shelter belt, lost approximately nothing. The shelter belt his grandfather Rudy had planted in the spring of 1935. 6 rows of trees running north-south along the west boundary of the farm, eastern red cedar on the outer rows, green ash in the middle, a Siberian elm on the inner rows, the whole thing 1,200 feet long and now 40 feet to 60 feet tall after 41 years of Nebraska growing, was doing in June of 1976 exactly what Rudy had planted it to do in the spring of 1935. It was stopping the wind. Let me tell you about Rudy Koenig, because you need to understand what he saw in 1935 before you can understand what he built. Rudy had come to Holt County from a German immigrant family that had homesteaded the 480 acres in 1898. He had taken over the farm from his father in 1922 and had farmed it through the drought years of the late 1920s and into the catastrophic drought and wind erosion of the 1930s with the specific determination of a man who has no alternative farm to go to and must make the one he has work. He had watched the Dust Bowl arrive in Holt County the way a man watches a flood, too slowly at first and then all at once. The grassland plowing of the 1910s and 1920s had turned sod that had held the soil for 10,000 years under the roots of native prairie grass. When the drought came and the grass died and the cultivated crops failed, there was nothing left to hold the exposed soil. The wind took it. On April 14th, 1935, Black Sunday, the day that produced the worst single dust storm of the entire Dust Bowl era, Rudy had stood on the Koenig farmhouse porch and watched a wall of darkness move across the northern Nebraska sky from the northwest. The storm had blotted out the sun at midday. The chickens had gone to roost. The temperature had dropped 25 degrees in an hour, and when it was done, there was a 1/4 inch of Koenig topsoil that had been in the west field in the morning and was somewhere in Iowa by nightfall. Rudy had walked the west field the next morning. He had knelt and dug his hand into the soil and felt the specific roughness of a surface where the fine particles have been stripped away and only the coarser sand and gravel remains. He had looked across the field to the west and seen what the wind had come from. 400 miles of open Great Plains to the southwest, nothing between the Koenig West Field and the Texas Panhandle but air. He had gone to the county soil conservation office that week. He had asked about shelter belts. The county SCS man, a man named Hartley, who had been planting shelter belts across Nebraska since 1934 under the Prairie States Forestry Project that Roosevelt had ordered the previous year, had shown Rudy the planting guides. 6 rows. Outer rows, dense conifers to break the initial wind force. Middle rows, fast-growing hardwoods to add height quickly. Inner rows for additional density close to the field. A belt 1,200 feet long would protect approximately 120 acres of field to its leeward side at full maturity. The protection zone extending 10 times the tree height in the downwind direction. Rudy had said, "When does it work?" Hartley had said, "The conifers start providing measurable wind reduction in 5 years. Full protection at full maturity takes 20 to 30 years. Rudy had said, "My grandfather homesteaded this farm in 1898. He paused. "I am planting for whoever is farming it in 30 years. He had planted the shelter belt in May of 1935 in conditions that were almost certainly wrong for tree establishment. The soil was dry, the wind was relentless, and everyone in Holt County who was not actively watching their farm blow away was focused on survival rather than 30-year investments in tree planting. But Rudy had carried water to the seedlings through the summer of 1935 and the summer of 1936, the worst 2 drought years of the Dust Bowl. Using water from the stock tank, he had managed to keep full through careful rationing. He had lost maybe a quarter of the original seedlings to the drought. He had replaced them the following spring. By 1940, the cedars were 6 feet tall and beginning to function. By 1950, the belt was 20 feet high, and the difference in soil movement between the Koenig West Field and the Dostal West Field to the west was beginning to be measurable, though nobody was measuring it. Let me tell you about the decision Carl's father made in 1961, because you need to understand the other path before you can understand what Len still had in 1976. In 1961, the Dostal family had the same shelter belt the Koenig family had. 6 rows of trees along the west boundary of their farm, planted in the 1930s under the same Prairie States Forestry Project, grown now to 30 feet and providing full protection to the field behind it. The protection was working. Wind erosion on the Dostal West Field, loss which was on the same soil type and the same slope as the Koenig West Field, was measurably lower than on the unprotected fields to the west. Carl's father Ed had also, by 1961, a new wide-bodied tractor that could not make the turn at the shelter belt headland without either hitting the tree row or leaving a significant unplanted strip at each pass. The shelter belt was 6 rows wide, roughly 60 feet, and the headland turn required for the new equipment added another 40 feet of maneuvering room on each side. In a 1,200-foot-long field, this meant approximately 100 feet of headland loss on each end, plus the 60 feet occupied by the trees themselves, a total of roughly 220 feet of field length lost to the shelter belt's footprint. On a 120-acre west field that was 1,200 feet wide east to west, 220 feet represented about 18% of the total width. Ed had calculated this. He had priced the timber. The mature green ash and Siberian elm were worth something to a local mill, the cedars less so. He had gotten offers from a couple of buyers and received $400 for the stand. He had cut the shelter belt in the fall of 1961. He had planted the 6 acres in corn the following spring. He had gained 18% of his west field width back and eliminated the awkward headland turns. Ed had told Rudy about the decision at the co-op. Rudy had listened. He had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, "I hope you don't need it back someday." Ed had said, "It's 6 acres of trees, Rudy. I need 6 acres of corn." Rudy had nodded. He had not said another word about it. But he had gone home and walked his own shelter belt that evening. He had looked at the trees, the cedars dense and dark on the outside, the ash and elm in layers behind them, the whole belt 40 feet high and solid. He had looked at his west field behind it. He had felt the wind on his face and noted where the wind dropped as he walked from the open ground west of the belt into the protected zone immediately east of the trees. He had not cut his shelter belt. Now let me tell you about what a shelter belt actually does, because the physics of it is the hidden advantage, and the hidden advantage is not visible until the wind blows hard enough and long enough. A mature shelter belt of the height and density that the Koenig belt had achieved by 1976, 40 to 60 feet tall, 6 rows deep, all 1,200 feet long, reduces wind velocity in its protected zone by 30 to 50% at ground level. This reduction extends downwind for a distance of approximately 10 times the tree height. At 60 feet of tree height, the full protection zone extends 600 feet to the east of the belt. The Koenig West Field, 120 acres running east from the shelter belt, is approximately 800 feet wide east to west at its widest point. The full protection zone of 600 feet covers approximately 75% of the field width. The remaining 25% at the far east end of the field receives partial protection. Wind velocity reduction of 10 to 20% rather than 30 to 50, but partial protection is still protection. Wind erosion of cultivated soil begins when wind velocity at the soil surface exceeds approximately 11 miles per hour. The June 19, 1976 wind event ran at 32 miles per hour with gusts to 44. Behind the Koenig shelter belt in the protected zone, the effective wind velocity at ground level was between 16 and 22 miles per hour, above the erosion threshold, but only barely, and only at the downwind edge of the protection zone. The actual erosion in the protected zone was minimal. On Carl's West Field, with no shelter belt protection, the full 32 to 44 miles per hour wind ran unobstructed across the surface from the southwest corner to the northeast corner. At those velocities, on a dry, cultivated surface with no residue cover, soil movement was not minimal. It was severe. The difference in soil movement between the two fields on June 19, 1976, was the difference between a shelter belt that had been growing for 41 years and a field that had not had one since 1961. It was not the only wind event that summer. There were 2 more, July 3rd and July 17th, both running at similar velocities for similar durations. By the end of July, Carl's West Field had lost the equivalent of 4 inches of topsoil off the sloped and exposed sections. The darker black Nebraska topsoil was thinning toward the gray-brown of subsoil on the knolls and rises. The field's productive capacity was measurably reduced. Len walked his west field after each event. He crouched and pushed his fingers into the soil the way his grandfather had taught him to assess soil condition. He found what he expected and what Rudy had planted the shelter belt 41 years earlier to ensure he would find: intact topsoil, dark and rich, sitting exactly where it had been at the beginning of June. He walked to the fence line between his west field and Carl's field to the west of the shelter belt. He looked at the contrast. His side of the fence, black. Carl's side, gray-brown on the rises, darker in the swales where some of the eroded material from upslope had deposited. He did not say anything to Carl about it. He walked back to his farm. Carl came to him. It was a Saturday in August, 3 weeks after the last wind event. Carl had driven to the Koenig farm and found Len in the machine shed. "Len," Carl said. "Carl, I need to know something." Carl paused. "Your west field. How much did you lose this summer?" Len said, "I had soil movement on the east end of the field past the full protection zone." He paused. "Less than a quarter inch across that section, maybe 15 acres. Carl looked at the machine shed floor. He said, "I lost 4 inches across my whole west field." He paused. "Most of it in 3 days in June and July." Len said nothing. Carl said, "Those trees your grandfather planted?" Len said, "Yes." Carl said, "How far back does the protection go?" Len said, "From the tree line? Full protection out to about 600 feet. Partial protection past that." He paused. "My west field is about 800 feet wide, so the far quarter gets partial protection, but not full." Carl said, "What is the full protection zone doing?" Len said, "Reducing wind velocity by about 1/3 to 1/2 at ground level." He paused. "Below the erosion threshold in most events." Carl was quiet. He said, "My father cut those trees in 61. Len said, "I know." Carl said, "He got $400 for the timber." Len said, "I know that too." Carl looked at the machine shed door. He said, "How many years does it take to grow a shelter belt back?" Len said, "From seedlings, 20 to 30 years to full protection." He looked at Carl. "Maybe 15 for partial protection if you use the right species." Carl said, "So I'm looking at 15 years minimum before I have any protection on the west field." Len said, "Yes." Carl said, "And how much topsoil do I lose in 15 years of unprotected dryland west field in Holt County?" Len did not answer that. Carl already knew the answer. He was not asking for information. He was doing the accounting out loud, the way a man does when the number is large enough that he needs to hear it said in order to believe it. Let me stop here and tell you what 4 inches of topsoil means in Nebraska dryland farming terms, because the number matters. Nebraska dryland topsoil, the specific dark loam of Holt County, contains, per inch of depth, approximately the following: 2 to 4 pounds of organic matter per square foot, the water-holding capacity that determines how much rainfall the soil can capture and store between rain events, and the biological community of bacteria, fungi, and earthworms that cycle nutrients and maintain soil structure. This is not a layer you can replace by adding fertilizer. You can add nitrogen and phosphorus from a bag. You cannot add the organic matter or the biological community or the accumulated water-holding capacity from a bag. You build those through time and plant residue and the specific process of soil formation that operates at roughly 1 inch per 500 years. Carl had lost 4 inches of topsoil in one summer. At 500 years per inch, he had lost 2,000 years of soil formation across the sloped sections of his west field in one drought summer. He was not going to get it back, not in his lifetime, not in his children's lifetime. What he was going to get, if he replanted the shelter belt immediately, was partial protection in 15 years and full protection in 25 to 30. During those 15 to 30 years, every wind event like June 1976 was going to take another fraction of an inch off his west field's topsoil that he was not going to recover. The math of the decision his father had made in 1961 was becoming clear in 1976. Ed had gotten $400 for the timber and 6 acres of corn ground. He had given back, through the topsoil loss on the unprotected west field, across 15 years of increased wind erosion, something that Len estimated conservatively at 60 bushels per acre per year in yield drag from the thinning topsoil. 60 bushels on 120 acres is 7,200 bushels per year. At $2.40 per bushel, that is $17,280 per year, accumulated across 15 years of increasing soil loss since 1961, against the $400 the timber brought in 1961. Len had not run this calculation for Carl. Carl had not asked for it, but both men understood. And standing in the machine shed on that August Saturday, what the shelter belt had been worth and what cutting it had cost. Carl said, "I am going to replant." Len said, "I know you are." He looked at Carl. "I'll help you plant it if you want." He paused. My grandfather left his notes from the original planting, species spacing, row arrangement, what he learned about establishment in drought conditions. Carl looked at him. He said, "Your grandfather kept planting notes." Len said, "He was that kind of man." He paused. He planted the belt in 1935 in a drought, carrying water to the seedlings for 2 summers. He kept notes on what survived and what didn't. Carl said, "He planted trees in the middle of the Dust Bowl." Len said, "Yes." Carl shook his head slowly. He said, "Every other farmer in the county was barely surviving that year." He looked at Len. How did he know to plant trees? Len said he had just watched his topsoil blow to Iowa on Black Sunday. He paused. He decided he was not going to watch it again. He looked at Carl. He didn't plant the trees for himself. He was 42 years old in 1935. He planted them for whoever would be farming this ground in 1975. Carl drove home. He called the Holt County SCS office the following Monday. He had his west field replanned for a 6-row shelter belt, cedar, ash, elm, the same species configuration Rudy had used in 1935. He planted the outer cedar rows the following spring. If you want to know what Rudy's planting note said, and what Len found when he went through them for Carl, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if your farm has a shelter belt and what year it was planted. The notes were in a composition notebook in the farmhouse desk, in Rudy's German-inflected hand in pencil that had faded but was still readable. 23 pages covering the 1935 planting, the 1936 replacement of lost seedlings, the watering schedule across 2 drought summers, the species survival rates, the row spacing, the observations Rudy had made in each subsequent year as the belt grew. The most important page was the last one Rudy had written in 1971, the year before he died. He had walked the shelter belt one more time and recorded his observations. He had written the tree heights by species. He had written the belt width. He had written a note at the bottom of the page that Len had read more than once since 1972 when he found it. The note said, "The trees will outlast me by 40 years if nobody cuts them. The field behind them will be black when I am not here to see it. This is the purpose of planting something you will not live to finish." Rudy Koenig had died in the winter of 1972 at the age of 79. He had not lived to see June 1976 and the wind events that proved what the shelter belt was doing. He had not needed to see it. He had known what it was doing every year since 1940, and he had written it down in 1971 in case anyone needed to be reminded. The trees will outlast me by 40 years if nobody cuts them. Nobody had cut them. The field behind them was black. The shelter belt is still on the Koenig farm. It is 90 years old now, the cedars enormous and impenetrable on the outer rows, the ash and elm massive in the middle and inner rows, the whole belt a windbreak that does not look like what a $50 investment in tree seedlings and 2 summers of carrying water becomes across 9 decades of Great Plains wind. Len's daughter farms the ground now. She has the composition notebook. She has walked the shelter belt every fall the way Len walked it and Rudy walked it, checking the trees for dead wood, looking for gaps in the outer cedar row that could let wind through, noting what the protected zone looks like compared to the open ground beyond the field boundary. She has not cut the shelter belt. She will not cut the shelter belt. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the things planted for the next generation by the generation that understood what the wind could do and decided not to let it do it again. Of the grandfathers who carried water to tree seedlings in the worst drought in Nebraska history and wrote down what they learned for whoever would come after them. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, does your family farm have a shelter belt? Who planted it and when? Is it still standing? Rudy Koenig planted 6 rows of trees in the spring of 1935 in the middle of the Dust Bowl because he had watched his topsoil blow away and decided he would not watch it happen again. He carried water to the seedlings for 2 summers. He kept notes. He died in 1972 without knowing whether the trees had done what he planted them to do. They had done it for 37 years by the time he died. They have done it for 54 more years since. The field behind the shelter belt is black. It has been black since 1940 when the cedars first began to function. It will be black for as long as someone keeps the trees. That was the purpose of planting something you will not live to finish. Rudy said so in 1971 in a composition notebook in his German-inflected hand. The notebook is in the farmhouse. The field is black. The trees are still there.